Mac-Talla tutoring, and today I am going to try and answer the question of how do you know when your strings need to be changed. So it's a question that I get asked quite a lot, and there isn't one simple response to it, unfortunately. There's a few different ways to think about it, and all of these ways will become more and more easy the longer you've been playing, and in particular the longer you've been playing your instrument, because you really get used to how it sounds and feels. But disclaimer aside, we'll try and look at it just now. So first question I would say is, how old are your strings? Most strings you can get a kind of rough idea online at how long they should last. It depends what type of string they are and what brand and everything. Be slightly wary of the amount of time that the brand of string tells you. They'll probably say a few months. Of course, that doesn't take into account how often you play, the environment they've been kept in, how well you've cleaned them, all of that kind of stuff. So it's not a definitive answer at all. It's also important to remember that, you know, if your fiddle's been sat in a cupboard for 3 years and you've not played it, your strings do still degrade. So if you haven't played your fiddle for a long time, it's probably worth just changing your strings and save yourself the bother of trying to work it out. But if you're still not sure, next thing I would say to look at is your strings. How do they look themselves? So you're looking at things like, are they quite grubby and dirty? So I'm actually going to change my strings today. You probably can't really see the fine details on it, but you know, they're not looking great. So there's no fraying, but if you do see any fraying, it'll probably be along the bridge, or you know, any points where there's friction. If there's any fraying on your strings, then absolutely change them straight away, because if they break, it's not very fun, especially not if you're playing. So that's the first thing to have a look at. Also, fiddle strings will be coated or wound. You know, what they're wound with varies. However, as you can see, so I've got a gold string here, and you can see that actually the coating has worn off in some of these places. So it's definitely due a change today. I think you can see this one's the most obvious. Obviously the E string's the thinnest, so it's most likely to wear out quicker. It's really just a tiny bit of wire. So there's so far we've got how old are the strings and how are your strings looking. If you're still not sure, the next thing I'd think about is your tuning. How often are you having to tune your fiddle, sorry. Has that increased recently? If your fiddle's really not holding its tuning like it used to, it's time to change the strings. This can be quite a good indicator, because the longer you've had the strings, the worse they are at holding their tuning. Basically, they're too stretched, and every time you tighten it, you're stretching it, and it reaches a point where it's just had enough. So that's the next thing to look at. And the last thing before we get on to how it actually sounds and everything is, how often have you been putting rosin on your bow? There's something that I think is a good indicator for me, is that I notice I feel like I need to put more rosin on the bow. Doesn't actually seem to make any difference. There's a mix of reasons for that. One of them being, you know, this is caked with rosin now. I've been playing so much, even though you wipe it in between playing and yada yada. It just gets to the point where the bow just doesn't feel like it's sticking properly. So if you've reached that point, again, time to change your strings. Okay, so far we have looked at or thought about signs that are not actually to do with playing the fiddle. This is because how the string sounds and how the string feels changes quite gradually. You know, it's a bit like watching someone you live with grow. You don't really notice, and it can creep up on you and can be quite bad before you notice, if that's the only thing that you're paying attention to. It does get a lot easier to notice these things, as I said at the beginning. If you know your thing and you're confident with your strings, then that's absolutely fine to rely on that. And once you're in tune with the fiddle, then it's a lot easier to rely on these. So how do the strings feel? As I said, coated or wound, if they're starting to come undone, it can feel a bit unpleasant. Not hugely noticeable unless it's really bad, but something you're aware of. Are you having to put more pressure on the string to make it make a nice noise? Is it, you know, bow, fingers? You again will adjust gradually, but try and keep an eye on it. The older your string is, the more pressure you'll need. If you play too long like that, then you'll get into all sorts of bad habits. And lastly, how does your string sound? So obviously that's probably the main thing you'd think about. You'll get a lot more squeaks, especially from your E string. Yeah, it's quite nice. If you're wondering why you're suddenly squeaking and it's probably your strings, then that will be quite nice for you. Yeah, that's the main thing. But also, they sound so lifeless. I don't know. Now, this is where knowing your own fiddle really helps, but the sound starts to be quite dull or dampened. You can lose a lot of the sort of ringing sound of your fiddle, the crispness of the notes. And it also sounds a little bit quieter. And lastly, your tuning can be a bit harder, partly because it keeps slipping out of tune, and also just because you're having to apply that bit more pressure, you're bending the string a bit. It just doesn't feel quite right. Not the most helpful, I know, but you will get to know that the more you do it. So, to recap, starting with not playing the fiddle, looking at it. So, how old are your strings? How do your strings look? Literally pick up your fiddle, examine your strings. If they look okay, but you're still not sure. How is it tuning? Are you having to tune it more often? Are the pegs slipping more? How often are you putting rosin on your bow? Does it feel like you just can't get good purchase? If you're still not sure, carry on. How do the strings feel? Are you having to put more pressure? Are you feeling a bit uncomfortable on your fingers? And lastly, how does it sound? If you are hearing more squeaks and feeling like you just can't get a nice tone, probably time. If you're still not sure, obviously ask someone, maybe you've got a teacher, or feel free to drop me a message and I can try and help you. But I think as a general rule, if you think maybe it's time to change your strings and it has been a few months since you've changed them, I would say probably change them. It is amazing how much difference a good set of strings makes on your fiddle. Okay, so any questions? As I said, you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, Mac-Talla Tutoring, or drop a comment below and I will try and help as best I can. Happy playing!